A quiet Friday afternoon in a small California suburb. Kids are riding bikes, families are heading home from work. Nothing about this day feels unusual. But within the next 2 hours, this peaceful neighborhood will become the center of one of the most explosive, chaotic, and deadliest law enforcement confrontations in American history. All because 4 men with rifles, a pickup truck, and a belief that the world was about to end decided to rob a bank. This is the story of the Norinco bank robbery, and trust me, nothing about it went according to plan. To understand what happened on May 9th, 1980, you first have to understand the man who set it all in motion, George Wayne Smith. On the surface, George looked like any ordinary young man. He was involved in school activities, sang in his church choir, played sports. But underneath that normal exterior, George had a mind that was always running toward dark places. Even as a teenager, he talked openly about fantasies of violence, of robbing armored trucks, of living and dying dramatically. When he enlisted in the military, those tendencies didn't fade, they sharpened. During his service, George received classified training in the handling of tactical nuclear weapons. He was young, impressionable, and suddenly given an up-close look at just how much destructive power existed in the world. The Cold War was at its peak. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a tense standoff, each side holding enough nuclear warheads to end civilization several times over. For George, this wasn't an abstract political situation. It was a personal revelation. He became convinced that nuclear war wasn't just possible, it was coming. It was inevitable. When he returned home from Germany, his personal life had already crumbled. His wife had left him while he was overseas, and so George, searching for something to hold on to, found his way to a church community that preached about biblical prophecy, end times, and the signs of approaching judgment. For a man who already believed civilization was on borrowed time, this was gasoline on a fire. He became deeply committed to the idea that the apocalypse was near and that he needed to prepare for it, not just spiritually, but physically, practically, survivalist style. George wasn't alone in this thinking for long. At a Parks Department job in 1973, he met a man named Christopher Harvin. On paper, the two were very different, but they shared a love of firearms, survival skills, and a deep skepticism about the stability of modern society. George pulled Christopher into his worldview, and Christopher was receptive. The two became convinced that by 1982, a rare planetary alignment would trigger massive seismic events, splitting California apart, collapsing governments, throwing the world into chaos. They had a timeline, and they had a mission. Together, George and Christopher pooled their resources and eventually moved their families onto a property in Riverside County, just outside Los Angeles. What followed was a methodical, obsessive preparation effort. They bought dozens of firearms. They built a bunker stocked with emergency supplies. They even dug an escape tunnel beneath the property. To fund all of this, they tried growing and selling marijuana out of a greenhouse on the property, but that venture, like most of their plans, ran into trouble. Then the bottom fell out entirely. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution sent global oil prices skyrocketing, and the ripple effects crashed through the American economy. George and Christopher both lost their jobs, their families fell apart, and suddenly 2 men who had been planning for the collapse of civilization found themselves struggling to survive within it. Unemployment checks barely covered the basics, their mortgage was falling behind, and the apocalypse was supposedly just around the corner. That's when the idea of robbing a bank went from a dark joke to a genuine plan. It started almost accidentally. George mentioned to Christopher that he was thinking about knocking over a Denny's restaurant with a friend. Christopher laughed it off. If you're going to risk everything, at least make it worth it. Rob a bank. He meant it sarcastically, but both of them knew they needed money, and the idea stuck. To pull it off, they needed a crew. George reached out to a friend named Manny Delgado, a man drowning in credit card debt with a pregnant wife at home. Manny said yes without much hesitation. Manny brought in his younger brother, Billy, a 17-year-old dealing with serious chronic health conditions, who saw this as a way to pay for medical treatment. And without telling Christopher, George quietly recruited Russell's own younger brother, Russell, who was months behind child support and desperate to avoid jail. By the spring of 1980, 5 men were committed to a plan that was either going to solve all their problems or destroy them entirely. The robbery itself was supposed to be clean and fast. George had chosen the Security Pacific Bank in Norco, California. He knew it well. He was actually a customer there and had spent time quietly mapping the layout of the branch and the routines of the staff. The plan was to hit on a payday when the vault would be at its fullest. They projected they could walk away with up to $300,000. To buy themselves time, they planned to detonate a decoy explosive in a different part of town to pull local police attention away from the bank. Billy would stay outside as a lookout while the others went in. After the robbery, they'd switch to pre-positioned vehicles with stolen license plates and split into 2 groups, eventually heading to Las Vegas to launder the cash. On paper, it sounded almost reasonable. In reality, it collapsed almost immediately. The decoy bomb was placed, but it didn't create the distraction they expected. When the 4 men entered the bank, the robbery lasted only minutes. They grabbed what they could, far less than they'd hoped, and rushed out. But a bank employee had already triggered the silent alarm. By the time the crew hit the street, law enforcement was already mobilizing. What followed was something no one, not the robbers, not the police, not the residents of that quiet California suburb, could have anticipated. The crew piled into a stolen van and fled. Almost immediately, patrol officers made contact and the shooting began. These weren't ordinary firearms the robbers were carrying. While the average officer on patrol at the time carried a standard revolver with a limited number of rounds, George and his crew had military-grade semi-automatic rifles, multiple shotguns, handguns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. The firepower imbalance was staggering, and it showed. As the chase tore through the streets, the robbers opened fire on pursuing officers, destroyed police vehicles, and detonated improvised explosive devices, homemade grenades fashioned from beer cans. A police helicopter tracking them from above was forced into an emergency landing after taking fire. The pursuit stretched across more than 40 miles, pulling in units from 6 separate law enforcement agencies. Dispatchers were overwhelmed, communication between agencies was fragmented, and the robbers, despite the chaos, kept moving north, out of the suburbs and into the winding, steep roads of the San Gabriel Mountains. George was shot in the leg during the chase and was losing blood, but they kept driving. Deep in the mountains, on a narrow road carved into the hillside, Christopher was pushing the stolen truck hard around sharp curves, stopping periodically to lay down suppressing fire against the officers behind them. The terrain was working in their favor. The roads were muddy, visibility was low, and the pursuing officers had to slow down through every blind turn, never knowing if an ambush was waiting. But then the truck's headlights lit up the end of the road. A landslide had taken out the path ahead. There was nowhere left to go. The 4 remaining robbers, Billy and Manny had already been separated from the group, took cover behind their truck and turned to face what was coming. What followed was a brief but brutally intense firefight. A Riverside County deputy came around the bend and was immediately caught in the crossfire. Despite being severely outgunned, he managed to return fire and hit Christopher before taking a life-threatening wound himself. Another deputy arrived, fumbled with an unfamiliar M16, finally got it loaded, and opened fire. The shooting stopped. When the smoke cleared, the robbers had vanished into the dark hillside on foot. Law enforcement regrouped, called in reinforcements, and launched a full mountain search the next morning. George was found quickly. He had barely made it through the night, bleeding heavily and unable to carry his rifle. Christopher and his brother Russell were arrested separately. Manny Delgado evaded capture for 2 more days before being cornered. He died from a combination of officer fire and a self-inflicted wound. Billy Delgado did not survive the chase. Deputy James Evans, 39 years old, a father of 6, was killed in the final confrontation on the mountain road. A street in Norco was later renamed in his honor. The Norco incident, before September 11th, stood as the largest crime scene in American law enforcement history, a 40-mile stretch of destruction from a suburban bank to a mountain dead end. Dozens of police vehicles were damaged, 8 officers were wounded, a 12-year-old bystander lost part of a finger. In the days that followed, law enforcement agencies scrambled to rearm. The San Bernardino Sheriff's Office alone added dozens of automatic weapons and military-grade equipment to its fleet almost immediately. That moment of reckoning accelerated a broader national conversation about police militarization, a debate that has never fully ended. George Wayne Smith, Christopher Harvin, and Russell Harvin were each sentenced to life in prison. Russell died behind bars. Christopher remains incarcerated. In 2018, George publicly expressed remorse for what happened that day, acknowledging the pain caused to the families of those who were lost. The end of the world he had spent years preparing for never came. The apocalypse he feared turned out to be the one he helped create on a quiet Friday afternoon in a small California suburb.